One of the potential harms here is that it's difficult for us when we're in this period of development where we're really settling into our identity to appropriately assess when someone is abusing a power imbalance that exists in our relationship, particularly when there's this attitude of reverence for the partner. Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for coming back if you've been here before, or hi, welcome if you're new. My name's Mickey. I'm a therapist, and we talk about therapy things on this channel. Today, we are talking about something that's sort of therapy adjacent. It's relevant to me, and this is my channel, so we're talking about it. That said, I have gotten a couple of requests to talk about Billie Eilish and what is his fucking name? What is his first name? Jared. I wanted to call him Kiefer Sutherland, and I know that's not right. Why can I not remember his name? I've literally been talking about this all week. Yeah. Not Kiefer Sutherland. Not him. Jesse Rutherford. We are talking about Billie Eilish and Jesse Rutherford because Billie Eilish just did her same interview for the 6th year in a row with Vanity Fair and spoke a little bit about her relationship with him, but also just generally TikTok has been having a field day with this relationship and talking about it. And I have gotten a couple of requests from people in the past and now to talk about age gap relationships. Are they toxic? What's the deal? What's my perspective on it as a clinician, as a person? So we're covering all of those things today. Before we get into it, if you're new here, hi, thanks for coming. You should subscribe. We talk about this and like other educational stuff, so I'd love to have you stay. Thanks so much. As per usual, I have compiled a list of resources and things for your perusal that I will list in the description, especially as they're relevant to my opinion and like what the research says about the phenomenon of age gap relationships. Jesus. Also be nice to me. The words are not coming out of my mouth today. It's been a long day. I don't know what's going on. So we're rolling with it. Okay, the first thing that I want to address is I want to be super clear off the top. Age gap relationships, personally, like as a human being, I'm not like a huge fan of them. However, I know there are going to be people in my comment section saying that I am in a relationship with someone who is 75 years my senior and we are so happy and we've never been happier. How dare you attack my relationship? I want to be super clear, that's not what I'm doing. While I personally and clinically am not a fan of this phenomenon, that is not to say that every age gap relationship ever is toxic, can't be healthy, should be avoided at all costs, or that I have the answers about every relationship ever, always. Research informs us about broad strokes, what we know to be true generally for most people as part of the human experience, particularly as it relates to varying demographic groups. And so I want to be clear that we're speaking about it from that lens today. I don't pretend to have all of the answers about everyone's relationships always, and I don't want to speak prescriptively about what you should or should not do, because this channel is about broad strokes learning and education and sometimes entertainment, but certainly not about telling you specifically what you're supposed to be doing, because unfortunately I'm just a person on the internet who likes to talk about therapy things, and so I don't know you. I'm sure you're wonderful, but I can't speak to your specific life, A, because I don't know you, and B, because that's very much illegal. So I want to be super clear, that's not what we're doing. That said, the research does tell us a couple of things about age gap relationships that I think are worth noting. That was the cutest little hop echelon. My sweater's already covered in cat hair. Why don't you make a cameo? Catio? The first thing that I wanted to talk about is the inherent power imbalance that exists in age gap relationships. A lot of folks are apt to comment on this, particularly on TikTok. I've seen that a lot lately, and I think this is worth addressing because, again, I have my own personal opinions about this. To be super clear, I am making this video like 99% as a professional in my clinical view based on the research and my education. While it is important for me to acknowledge that I do have biases, I do feel relatively confident in my ability to speak objectively about this issue. But while I do have my own personal opinions about this, it's really important for us to talk about, generally, what does the research say about this type of relationship? While we don't necessarily have a lot of robust and timely research about this phenomenon, because it's kind of a difficult thing to study and because it's somewhat new in terms of our cultural interest and fascination with whether or not this is an ethical thing to be doing, we do have certain resources and places of information to draw from in regards to different features of age gap relationships, and one of those is the power imbalance that exists. I think it's really important for us to acknowledge when we talk about a couple like Billie Eilish and Jesse Rutherford. Billie Eilish has spoken publicly about her interest or fascination or reverence for Jesse as a person because he was famous when she was a child and before she was famous herself. There's a power imbalance that exists there. That's very important for us to acknowledge. But on top of that, when people have varying levels of lived experience, and you're in a relationship with someone who has more lived experience than you, there is a power imbalance that exists there in that more lived experience, more time on this earth simply by existing, you just have more time to learn things, to experience things, to flesh out what it is to be a human being. It's not to say that all people who are, 27 have the exact same amount of life experience, but just statistically speaking, when we talk about like how likely you are to have learned certain lessons or to have mastered certain skills or have the ability to effectively communicate and like blah, blah, blah. The more time that you have on this planet having been alive, the more time that you have to develop those skills. And so the skill set, the ability, the like interpersonal skills that someone who is 20 years old is going to be very different than someone who is 30 years old, 40 years old, 50 years old, etc. Unfortunately, this is just the way that time works as a linear function, and so that's important for us to acknowledge. The research does seem to indicate that relationships that have a power imbalance within it, I want to be very careful about how I say this. The reason I want to be careful about this is that I don't want folks to walk away from this video thinking being in an age gap relationship means that you're just like bound to end up in a situation that's abusive. A lot of the rhetoric that's flying around online is sort of like speaking very prescriptively about this and saying like definitively, if you're in a relationship where there's a significant age gap, it is a foregone conclusion that you will be abused. That's not necessarily true. The research does inform us that, again, relationships with a power imbalance have a higher risk factor for experiencing intimate partner violence, which is commonly referred to as domestic violence or DV. However, again, I want to be clear, that's not like a foregone conclusion. It's just an important risk factor for us to be aware of. In the same way, if you're at all familiar with the ACE study, I will link that below. There is a study about ways that certain childhood experiences cause us to have a higher potential risk for developing mental illness later in life. And so the more boxes that you check on an ACE questionnaire, the higher your potential risk is for developing mental illness. Not the more boxes you check on an ACE questionnaire, the more likely you are to have mental illness. It's just that you have a higher risk factor for potentially developing mental illness later in life. This is an important distinction for us to make. Again, I want to be clear. Research allows us to speak broadly about the human experience, but not to definitively say engaging in this behavior means you will experience this. One of the other things about this situation that I wanted to address is the self-esteem factor. I mentioned earlier that Billie Eilish has spoken about how she kind of idolized Jesse Rutherford when she was younger because she grew up listening to his music and things like that, but also because I think this is an important moment to talk about the way that our brains develop over time. As a therapist, this is something I feel relatively comfortable discussing. Again, I'm going to link sources in the description so you guys know that I'm not just talking out of my butthole, but to be clear, the way that our brain and our self-image develops over time is that in ideal circumstances, in typical circumstances, barring other barriers and trauma and things like that, the older that we get, the higher our self-esteem is. We do experience dips in this because developmentally it's like appropriate. I know that sounds fucked up, but like we go through periods of time, particularly adolescence and like the preteen, teenage years, where we have potential dips in self-esteem as a result of peer pressure and like just generally going through it, developmentally speaking. However, we know that our self-esteem has a somewhat linear progression over time in that we tend to feel more confident in ourselves, more situated in ourselves, and also more able to advocate for ourselves and for our wants and needs to be met as we continue to get older and as our relationships solidify and our sense of identity settles. We know that those like early adulthood years, I don't want to use exact numbers because first of all, there are varying schools of thought about this. There's like a whole bunch of different developmental theories. But second of all, I don't know that that's necessarily useful, but for the sake of example, somewhere between like 17 to 25, we know that the frontal lobe is just about finished cooking around the time that you're 25. These years are typically where it's most common for folks to report really coming into that sense of identity and discovering who you are, what you believe in, what you want your relationships to look like, the things that really matter to you. We settle more into a consistent sense of self in these years. And so I think it's really important for us to discuss age gap relationships in regards to how this phenomenon affects us. The research also seems to indicate that people who are younger adults tend to rely a lot more on feedback during the boundary setting process, meaning that they're a lot more susceptible to change and adjust those boundaries based on the way that the folks they are setting boundaries with react to them. And this is noteworthy when we talk about a relationship where one person is in this potentially fluid state or like age where your identity tends to be more fluid and one person is not. Again, I want to own that I have my own personal opinions about age gap relationships. However, I don't want to get on the internet and just like use this platform to spew my own personal opinion. It feels important that we talk about evidence-based practice and research and science and facts here. And so I wanted to talk about this in relationship with this. Again, not because I'm here trying to character assassinate anyone or to cast doubt on whether someone says that they're happy or they're safe or not, but because it's worth unpacking for us as a culture and as a society to really address what are the risk factors here. What are the potential harms and I guess potential benefits also, but for this, we're talking mostly about the potential harms of engaging in a relationship like this. One of the potential harms here is that it's difficult for us when we're in this period of development where we're really settling into our identity to appropriately assess when someone is abusing a power imbalance that exists in our relationship, particularly when there's this attitude of reverence for the partner. If the partner who has a disproportionate amount of power is also viewed in this like up on a pedestal way, there is really a lot of potential for harm there, and it's really important for us to talk about that. This is also further compounded by potential like marginalized identities that a person might possess. Being an AFAB person, being a person of color, being a queer person, all of these are potential risk factors in terms of experiencing intimate partner, why do I keep saying that? Intimate partner violence. And so it's worth noting that that's also a risk factor there. Nobody make fun of me for my face turning red. It's really hot in here. Also, I'm wearing a sweater because it's supposed to be winter and it's just hot here. One of the other things that I wanted to talk about, which the research for this is in the description, it does seem to be indicated in the research that our confidence and our level of skill mastery also increases as we age. This is important for us to note, particularly in the context setting boundaries like we talked about earlier, but also in communicating, in assessing what it is that I want to need, in being able to validate what it is that I want to need. All of these are like crucial things that we grow into as we get older. And I also want to be clear, I don't want to cast doubt on people's ability to know these things or like to say if you're this age, therefore like you're dumb or incapable or like woefully ill-equipped to be making decisions about your relationships, because again, that's also not true in every case. However, it is backed by the research that the older we become, the more confident we are in that skill mastery. And that's a really important thing for us to walk into adult and long-term relationships with, because again, if there is the power imbalance there or whether there's not a power imbalance there, being able to carefully and clearly articulate what we need, to like validate in our own selves that these are okay things to want and need, and to also be able to assess whether someone is a safe person for us, or like, you know, evaluating behavior patterns over time and things like this. That's something that we become more skilled in as we grow. Again, there's like 75 different freaking theories about human development and like the particular skills that we develop at particular times. I'll link my LCSW study guide in the description if you want a like very brief cliff notes of all of those, or you can just Google them. There's like really common like little diagrams that people use to explain these. But generally the research is pretty clear that again, the older that we get, the more confident we are in that skill mastery, and the more effective we are at being our own advocates, especially when someone is behaving in like a bad faith way. Really quickly, one of the last things that I want to address before we wrap this bitch up, there's a lot of rhetoric about the like daddy issues thing, or like, you know, if you have a bad relationship with your parents, then you're sort of doomed to seek that out in your adult relationships. This can be true. It can also not be true. First of all, I want to discourage people from saying shit like this on the internet, because it's difficult for us to know anything about the intimate personal workings of celebrity lives, but about the lives of the people in our lives generally. It's also kind of a shitty fucking thing to say, unless there's like a high level of confidence and safety and trust between you and the person that you're discussing this with, and you're voicing this from a place of empathy and compassion. I would caution you against saying things like, you have daddy issues and so that's why you have shitty relationships, because like it really begs the question whether this is helpful or not. The research is also unclear about whether our attachment style definitively affects our ability to securely attach in relationships. This is sometimes true, and it's also sometimes not true. Like, we have research to support both of these things, and so I want to caution people against saying this, especially because a lot of times the like you have daddy issues thing is really steeped in misogyny and in wanting to devalue the voices and the experiences of AFAB and femme people, and so I obviously don't like that, and I don't want to encourage folks to lean too heavily into that. I think it's entirely possible that that could be a thing for some people, and it's also entirely possible that it's not. I also don't know to what degree it's safe or responsible for us to speculate about that, because our attachment to our primary caregivers is an inherently personal, sometimes trauma-wrought thing, and it's kind of fucked up for us to be speaking about it as if it's like tabloid drama, you know? Again, I want to make this content in the hopes of being educational and providing folks with resources about this. If you are a person who is in an age gap relationship and you feel strongly that this is healthy, this is safe, this is okay, that's your prerogative and you are allowed. However, I also want to encourage you to know that sometimes it can be very much a risk factor and it can be associated with negative outcomes. The research also seems to indicate that these types of relationships have lower relationship satisfaction for what that's worth. And if you are a support person or you are a parent or a friend who has a loved one that's in this relationship and you feel like looking at it from the outside, like this is bad news, this feels unsafe. One of the things that we know, and that has been very common in my clinical experience, is that nobody fucking likes an I told you so. When we have loved ones that make decisions that feel scary or that feel like this is not a bad or this is not a good call, you know, like this is a bad decision that you're making, it's really, really difficult for us to hold back this like, you know, like I'm older or I'm wiser and so I know better. And I'm going to force you to do the thing that I want you to do. Rarely, if ever, is this actually effective or helpful. One of the best things that we can do in this situation is to validate, especially if someone is an adult, that they are an adult and they're allowed to make their own choices. However, if at some point that changes, I'm here to be a supportive person, to not shame you, to not judge you, to not give you the I told you so, but to provide you with help and a safe place to just unpack how you're feeling, especially in regards to age gap relationships. It's entirely possible that there is an abuse of power happening there in some cases. And so for the sake of like interpersonal relationship skills building, people who struggle to leave abusive relationships, oftentimes there is like a long journey and a lot of learning that has to happen and like safety building that has to happen before someone has the resources to do that. One of the ways that we can be supportive as people on the outside is to be that safe person who is non-judgmental, who is empathic and empowering and ready to like provide whatever level of support someone is looking for. So again, I just want to caution folks against doing the thing of like, I told you so, and if you would have just only listened, because ultimately who's it helping other than serving your own ego? But also we know that this can be a primary reason that folks cut off contact with family and folks quote unquote on the outside when they're immersed in a situation that maybe eventually might start to feel unsafe. I know that this might not have been as salacious as y'all were hoping, but again, I want to make this content in the hopes that it's educational and that it's providing folks with tools and resources to like have your best and healthiest and happiest and safest relationships. Because while I may be a stranger on the internet, I do care very much about each and every one of you, and I hope that your skills and communities and yourselves are able to do that for you and for each other. So if you like the video, subscribe to the channel. We do stuff like this and like other stuff sometimes, so you should stay and share the video to help the channel grow and to help each other grow, and I will see you guys next Saturday. Okay, bye.